Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com. How do you make the decision to bring robots into your operation? In this episode, you'll find out how Webster Fulfillment decided to implement Locust Robotics into their Alabama 3PL and how their nearly 4-year automation journey has gone. I'm joined with Caleb Webster, president of Webster Fulfillment, and Sean Pinot of Locust Robotics to discuss the many different ways to go about taking the automation leap. Sponsored by Webster Fulfillment. Learn more about Webster Fulfillment at webster-fulfillment.com. Now take a listen to this episode originally broadcast live on LinkedIn.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Okay, hello, and welcome. We are live here, and today I'm going to be joined by Caleb Webster. He is president over at Webster Fulfillment, and I'm going to be joined by Sean Pinot, who is of Locust Robotics, representing the 3PL side, and Webster Fulfillment is a 3PL, so we're going to talk a little bit about their journey with automation and how they came to take the automation leap, which I understand has been about 4 years now almost, so a lot of experiences and takeaways there that we're going to learn from Caleb here, and they chose to go with Locust Robotics, hence why Sean is on the call. So Caleb and Sean, how are you guys today? How you doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Excited about being on the call today. Thanks for having us on. I'm excited to dive into this topic a little bit.
All right, definitely. And Sean, how you doing?
Yeah, happy to be on board and be a part of this on your show with a great partner, Webster Fulfillment. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So definitely automation, robotics, super hot topic in the industry, as we know. And we were just talking before we went live here, Modex is coming up around the corner, and I'm sure everybody that walks in there will be floored by the amount of automation robotics that is around everywhere. So definitely very interested to hear from Caleb on kind of the journey, the decision to be able to get to that point and realize that they need some automation and get there. But I guess before we get to that, so we kind of understand the business a little bit, Caleb, why don't you kind of give us a brief overview of Webster Fulfillment and kind of the development of the business and what you guys focus on?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, Kevin. So, before we dive into robots, so at Webster Fulfillment, certainly your traditional 3PL, I would say our niche or especially has always been apparel. As the business has grown and developed, we've certainly diversified outside of just the apparel world. But flat pack apparel is kind of the space that we got our start in. We were founded off of some internal brands that we still support to this day. We just saw a need some years ago. We saw a need in the marketplace for 3PLs that specialize in that apparel space and could handle flat pack apparel, and that's where we got started at. So again, we've diversified outside of that. We are still bootstrapped and ran headquartered here in Auburn, Alabama. We've just always tried to provide a level of service where the brands felt like they were represented by themselves, right, or we were a reflection of the brand owners. So yeah, that's us. That's a little bit about what we do. We're mainly a fulfillment center. We, being in the apparel space, we also do some apparel customization, embroidery, direct to garment, et cetera. But a bulk of our operations are focused around fulfillment and all the fun things that go along with that.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. And definitely great to hear too that you bootstrapped that as well, which I think is interesting. And, that you've had that focus and focusing on that overall customer experience, which is so important these days. And I'm curious, we're here to talk about automation, right? In that sense. And, I'm curious, like, when did you, along this journey of growing this company and this business, I mean, when did you start to maybe even just think about automation? Was that something that you initially wanted to go after, or was it something that kind of came along the way?
Yeah, no, not at all, Kevin. I wish that I could sit here today and say that when we founded the company, it was like in that original vision, but didn't think it was a possibility, and it certainly was not on the vision board. For us, it came along. It was kind of a twofold thing. I mentioned before we do specialize, and we did specialize in the early days in apparel fulfillment. What you typically see with apparel as a line is a large SKU count and maybe less quantity per SKU, right? And what comes along with that is an increased or a large pick path. And as we started aligning with some of the growth of the brands that we were supporting, the pick paths just got to the point to where most of the labor intensity involved in the job and in the picking process was, quite honestly, simply in the walking, right? Like our pickers were walking miles and miles per day. And it became a very labor intensive job, just traveling and dragging a cart throughout the facility. So that's really where kind of the initial interest into, like, how can we automate this job and make this job more efficient and effective? That's kind of where that initial query came from. And then I would be lying too for number two. I'd be lying if I said that we were exempt in any way from some of the labor challenges that many of us in the operations space faced, especially early on in the pandemic. And our brands that we represented, they depended on us being able to grow and scale with their growth. And we wanted to be at the forefront of that and being able to scale and handle spikes in volume and face that in a challenging labor market. So that's kind of when we went to the drawing board and we said, okay, there's got to be a better way. And we started exploring some solutions and doing some ROI comparisons, et cetera. That's kind of where the whole idea was born from.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that's certainly, the pandemic, I think for a lot of sense in automation and stuff like that. I mean, it certainly was a turning point to be able to realize that and see that, hey, we need to do something, right, to keep up, because certainly I was working in warehousing too at the time. And, it was such a challenge to get labor, and not only get the labor, but keep the labor too, as well, with everything going on. And I'm curious, I mean, Sean, did you see around that time kind of a big spike in interest from potential customers or customers in expanding their automation and robotics footprint?
Yes, absolutely. During the pandemic, there are a number of reasons why customers were interested in automation and specifically AMRs, not the least of which was the ability to sort of, reduce the number of heads that were required in a space. And by reducing the number of heads in the space, they're able to spread them out as well, right? So you're able to do more with less people, keep them further apart, which is all along the guidelines that we were hearing during that time. So the Locus AMR solution fit very well within that conversation. And then, flat pack apparel, what we're doing here at Webster fit right inside our wheelhouse as well. So it was a lot of good things coming together that made it a really great fit for a Locus AMR solution.
Interesting, and good to hear that. And yeah, I mean, I think that drove a lot of innovation and almost forced some people, I imagine, too, to have to look at some of those options. So, Caleb, why don't you kind of take us through kind of that beginning phase? You mentioned you went to the drawing board, you started looking at some ROIs and things like that. I mean, but how did you really kind of start to go about that? I mean, did you do that? Is that something you did internally? Did you work with a consultant? I mean, what would you recommend in that kind of beginning phase?
Yeah, for us, it was a lot of Googling and research and reaching out to network connections on LinkedIn. And then we hit the ground running. We started going and looking at some solutions, and we can kind of talk through what led us to the decision to ultimately go with Locus. But yeah, for us, it was just a lot of research. It was, I certainly think it's a crowded space now. It was certainly a crowded space at the beginning of the pandemic. There was a lot of interest. And so, it was just a lot of research, a lot of watching videos, a lot of talking to reps, and then go and seeing some live action in a production style environment, and then kind of making the decision from there. And then again, too, like early on, much different than probably a lot of these decisions are going to be for people. It was never, ROI was part of the conversation, but this was never an ROI play for us. This was surely a capacity play. We weren't looking to necessarily reduce positions. We were looking to be able to scale with the brands and grow with the brands and be able to provide capacity in a market that was not conducive to that. And so that was kind of where our initial game planning and strategy came from.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense to be able to, want to scale and grow versus, looking at the ROI in itself and seeing like, how do we able to kind of continue to compete and I guess retain some of the brands too, because I imagine at some point if the brand scales to a certain level and you can't keep up with what they require, they might be looking elsewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So very interesting there. And I think too, as we look at that, how did you kind of, because there's a lot of different types of options, right, from a picking perspective. And I'm curious, like, how did you start to narrow down maybe like form factor, like, how, like what type of robot did you want? What type of solution were you kind of focused in on, or did you have an idea of that from your Googling, or that didn't come along until you started to demo?
Yeah, it's a solid question. I think we had a number of factors that we wanted to consider. Shameless plug for Locust here. It was clear at the original conversation that they knew what they were talking about, and we tried to stay true to, when we had this original idea, we wanted to solve one problem. And that problem was our pick path had become so large that it was, there was this manual factor on the picking process now. And that's what we intended to solve. That's what we were after to solve. And then, getting capacity or whatever was an added play. And so we looked at a number of solutions. There was a number of solutions in the pot, I guess, to pick from, if you will. And what Locust solved so well for us, there was a number of, we call them follow bots, right? There were a number of follow bots out there that really didn't serve our purpose of, taking away the travel time. Yes, you weren't dragging a cart throughout the facility, but you're still traveling the full pick path, or at least a portion of the pick path. And then we looked at some solutions that were on the other end of the spectrum where they took the travel completely out. They required a full infrastructure change, meaning that the racking at the time, our pick space was, just over 300,000 square feet. And they would have required a full re-racking and a full redesign of the facility. And so that's ultimately what led us to Locust, is it was this right mix of, being able to reduce travel time, but yet we didn't have to come in and completely redo the infrastructure in the warehouse, re-rack the facility, stop production. And so there were options on both ends of the spectrum, but to us, like, Locust was the option that kind of met in that middle ground, solved the original problem that we were trying to solve, got us some added productivity in the mix. And that's kind of ultimately what led us to landing on the Locust solution.
Interesting. Yeah. And I've used the Locust solution before, so I can definitely see how you would kind of land on that if you want to reduce the overall travel time and the pick path time. So, Sean, maybe you want to elaborate on that a little bit from the Locust perspective. I mean, talk to us about how kind of the solution works to be able to reduce that overall walking time and travel time for the picker themselves.
Yeah, fantastic question. And Caleb really just hit on a lot of our value proposition, right? Reducing the non-productive travel time, the walking time, replacing that with AMR robotics. So what Locust Solution does is we do a swarming style robotic pick, which means that we have multiple robots per picker in the warehouse. So as a picker's making a pick with one robot that's right in front of them, other robots are traveling to pick locations ahead of that, so that as soon as the associate completes the pick, the robot he's interacting with drives away onto its next pick. And there's another robot within a certain proximity of that picker. Our software in the background is clustering all of the orders that are in the order pool to create a work density around the picker. So it's really the software that's driving the solution and driving all of the efficiencies. The robots are processing their travel locations and distance and making real-time decisions up to 10 times per second. So they're intelligently routing and rerouting as things, come into play. And all of that really at the end of the day is done just to drive optimal robot path, least amount of robot travel, optimal work conditions for the picker in the aisle and to drive as much work into their pick space as possible with the order pool that's there. So really, that's how Locust drives all of the value in the system, creating efficiencies. And then if we're doing all of that, properly, to Caleb's point, we are, bringing forward the ability to get more volume out of the existing space. So the other side of the coin is really our ability to kind of just be dropped into a brownfield warehouse and become, more or less a plug and play solution, right? There's some integration with the WM, but realistically, 95% plus of the time, we don't have to make any major infrastructure changes within a facility. We may ask for some subtle improvements or changes that are going to optimize the robot's ability to move throughout the space. So in some facilities, we may look to make some aisle cut-throughs and things like that so that the robots have more options for travel path. We don't get into traffic conditions that slow things down. But overall, we're a plug and play solution that can be dropped into a brownfield building. We don't change the original process that much, so it's not a foreign concept to the pickers that are in the building. So, training time for the folks is relatively quick and light, and we can be up and running, within just a few months from concept to go live.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think when I think about the solution, I mean, I kind of liken it the most to like basically a zone pick type of setup, right? Where somebody's just there and they're, the robot's coming to them and they're responsible for just this section of shelving or rack. I mean, is that kind of the correct interpretation?
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, that's definitely one way it's done, and probably the most common is a zone type setup where the associate's responsible for a number of aisles. And we can also run it as more of a sweeping type of setup as well. So like if you're working a left to right, the robots and the flow of the orders can also run that way. It really, we're going to work with the customer's team, understand how they like to process orders today, what that looks like, and then what's going to be the best application with robotics in the space.
Got it. Interesting. And I'm curious, Caleb, how do you guys have it kind of set up?
Yeah, I was hoping I'd get a chance to comment on that. So, Kevin, I think that's one thing that I'll call out from early on when we were looking at solutions, right, is like for us, we use a blend of each of those scenarios, and we rely on our floor leadership to kind of call the ball or call the shot when it's time to adjust from scenario to scenario. That's one of the things that we got into early on is very, very easy to identify efficiencies in the automation world on paper. And then when you put them in a real world scenario, like there has to be some adaptability there. And, that's one of the things when we were evaluating solutions. Obviously, the more orders, right, in our world, the more orders that you have in queue, the more you can optimize that pick path or that batch of orders. And so for us, like it's a blend of both, right? Like we want to optimize the batch of orders and make it as efficient as possible to pick. But part of our claim to fame also is how quickly and fast we get the orders out the door. And so depending on, quite honestly, the time of day it is, if we're getting close to cutoff where we've reduced that batch of orders down to, at times just a handful of orders, then we kind of rely on our floor leadership to adjust the style. And I will say that's another good positive to the Locust solution is that it's nimble enough that, it doesn't have to be done one way or the other. We can zone pickers out in the morning and we can have them start working the full pick path in the afternoon as we get kind of closer to that order cutoff. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, if you will.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really smart approach, and it makes sense. Like as you're trying to do higher volume and get that through, and also have that flexibility as well. So let's take it kind of a step back here, because we talked about how you kind of came around to the selection, which ultimately ended up being Locust. But I'm curious, like, what did the implementation look like? So you've selected who you're going to work with, and now what did it take to kind of put that in place? And did you have to change anything about your operations, or was it kind of easy to put in? I mean, how did that go?
I think overall it was probably one of the easier implementations of projects that we've carried out, and simultaneously one of the larger implementations we've done. We like a good challenge here, and so we probably cut the timeline a little bit short as to what would have been ideal, but we rolled out in a matter of a few months. Not a ton. Again, we selected this option because it didn't require a ton of infrastructure changes. But there was a lot to do in the background, building the APIs out between our WMS and the Locust solution. And so that started a couple of months out. We did all that in a sandbox environment, so we never had to really cease production. A huge shout out to our WMS, Ship Hero, and the Viking consulting team who helped kind of lead that integration rollout process. And so that was kind of the first step, was getting the integrations built out, getting the APIs communicating appropriately. And then from there on, we did a few small infrastructure changes, some aisles that were a little bit too narrow, very, very few. Probably the biggest thing, and it seems like the simplest thing, but now all of a sudden when you've got, several robots roaming the floor, all of a sudden the stuff in the way and the floor and the aisles, it matters. And so, it was adjusting some aisle space, but it was also making sure that, desks were, and all the things that go along with desks, they were in the appropriate locations, and that area was mapped off, and ladders and other things that you find in a warehouse had an appropriate location, and they weren't blocking travel areas. Put up a few guardrails. So there were some minor infrastructure changes that we had to make throughout the facility just to make sure that it was well positioned to roll robots out. And then after that, the Locust team has a very mapped out process of what rollout looks like, from providing people on site, providing calls beforehand, and just making sure that we're ready to go. And then once the robots are delivered, they'll send a team out on site, and I'll let Sean, he can probably talk a little bit more details. It's been a few years now since we've gone through the rollout process, but I'm sure their process has even improved since then. But they sent teams out, we mapped the facility, we did some dry runs, and then super happy to say that we never, through the course of rollout, we never lost a day of productivity. We had about 2 days that we operated at probably about 50% of capacity, but we shipped every single day during rollout and never had a full day of downtime. So that's kind of what it looked like for us, but no real challenges. I think the key was getting those APIs and getting that communication and webhooks and all the things that go along with that, getting that kind of rolled out in a sandbox environment and getting the kinks worked out. That was a huge help. But yeah, that's kind of what the implementation process looked like.
Nice. Yeah. I think that's fantastic that, you didn't have to stop shipping, because obviously that's, one of the biggest things I think in operations is we never want to stop shipping, right? So I mean, it's good to hear that. But Sean, did you want to chime in there on kind of the implementation process? As Caleb mentioned, they did it quite a while ago. Maybe there's some updates there.
Yeah, I mean, Caleb and the team were great partners. They were fantastic to work with. They did have a lot of balls in the air, from what I understand. During that time, they were making some WMS changes and some other site changes that were being done. And they were actually willing to cut a couple of entryways into some existing walls that helped with travel and traffic flow. So kudos to them for being a great partner. I think that's probably priority one, to have a job go smooth, right, and have things go successfully for both sides. Beyond that, he hit the nail on the head with the way things go, right? We do all of the integration work up front. Big part of that is just aligning on what the messaging needs to be, aligning on all of the different exception handling, drop-off points, and pick locations. So as long as we've got a good partner that's coming to the table, ready to talk and work through all those details, we'll be in great shape. And then post-go live, we do have some additional support on site post-go live. And another big factor of what we do, and something we're going to be going through in the coming months again with Caleb here, we've got some initiatives with Webster in place, is we have an optimization team that works with our customers through the life of the contract with Locus. So, here we are 3 years down the road with a great customer. We're looking at their numbers, their UPH, their LPH, and we're looking at ways to drive some improved efficiencies and operational gains within the Locus system at their facility. So some of the things we're going to be looking at is what the slotting looks like. Do we have too many robots going to certain pick locations, at the same time? Is there an opportunity to maybe spread some specific product out a little better, either closer to induct or farther from induct, depending on what the travel paths look like? And just whatever we can do with our team from a mapping, maybe the robots position themselves differently at the pick locations to drive more efficiency. We've got what we call a clover set up now, where multiple robots can stop at one pick location, so they don't have to queue a few feet away and then travel up. They can actually stop closer to that pick location. So again, there's a number of things that we will do through this optimization exercise that we're going to be going through coming up, to help the team at Webster get some incremental gains and eke out some more UPH, LPH out of this environment.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that's fantastic. I mean, to have that kind of ongoing support and continued optimization, beyond just the initial implementation is certainly a great thing. And, speaks to the continuous improvement that we all love within the warehousing industry and being able to do that. And I'm curious, Caleb, I mean, we talked kind of like from an infrastructure perspective on the implementation and, how did that impact your shipping and things like that. But I'm curious, like, what was the employees' reaction? Like, how did the employees react to robots coming in? I mean, was there any resistance? Because I know, especially you're talking 3-4 years ago, I mean, there was still a lot of skepticism on, robots taking my job. I mean, how did that go, and how was that kind of adoption phase with the employees you had in place?
Yeah, very, very fair question. And probably on our kind of job board after we started talking about this with the leadership team as a project, it was our number one concern, right? And, we try to do with everything. I have just a phenomenal leadership team here who communicates very well. And we just tried to hit it right, right from the beginning. We had a meeting before we ever got close to rollout with the entire team. And we were transparent about the rationale behind our decision. And, again, the rationale for us was never ROI, which means never reducing labor. It was to be able to grow. And the team, especially the team that we had at the time, they had already saw some of the brand growth that we had in house, and they understood. And quite honestly, dragging a cart through the warehouse for 20 miles a day is just not fun. And so we were able to offset some of that skepticism with future outlook and rationale, and I think that was what was important to a successful rollout for us, was just being upfront and transparent about it right from the beginning. And now I can't. We joke about this all the time. Like I just can't imagine going in our current setup going back to a manual pick process. And so now it's like the decision should have never even really existed. So, but yeah, it's a very fair question, and it's something that we were very concerned about early on, was what the perception was going to be. But we just tried to be transparent and communicate it and talk through it, and it proved to be a non-event for us.
Interesting. Yeah. And I'm curious, I mean, after, the implementation, obviously you said it was a concern for you guys there, but, the Locus is known for, easy to use interface and some of the gamification features as well. I mean, how did your employees start to kind of take to some of those things? And I mean, was it long before they were thankful to not be walking 20 miles a day in the warehouse anymore?
No, I think it was almost instantaneous. They loved it. They got, go home and talk to their families about working with robots at work. And, there were certainly, some skeptics, but I mean, it was probably the day of, it was like all that worry went away, and they're just fun. Like at the end of the day, it's fun to get out on the floor and pick orders now. And so I think all that's self-resolved.
Interesting. Yeah, I can imagine definitely, and especially reducing that travel time for them, and them, being maybe a little less tired at the end of the day because of that. I think would be a great thing. I mean, Sean, what are your thoughts on kind of that sentiment, which I think is dying in the industry a bit at this point? But what are your thoughts on that sentiment that robots are coming in and potentially taking jobs, or employees might be skeptical about the initial like rollout of them?
Yeah, I'm glad you came back to me and asked me. Being in a number of warehouses, working with, a large number of different customers in the role I'm in now, I definitely have a strong opinion of that. I think for Locust specifically, right, we use a cobot, right? It's a collaborative robot. So in its nature, we inherently need to have, humans assisting and humans doing the actual picking, right? That's how we're set up today. That's how things are. I think largely, walking warehouses and asking the folks, the boots on the ground folks that are actually doing the picking, working with the robots, the perception and the feedback I often get is that they see, for a lot of these folks for the first time in their work life inside a warehouse, that their management team and their ownership teams are making an investment in them and into the very specific, very, frontline job that they're doing every day. So I think it's well received. I think there definitely is a opportunity for some confusion and
Mm.
some anxiety leading into it, right? Because they don't know essentially what's coming into the warehouse till we get there. But I think once they see the Locust robots, understand how we work, understand that, they're going to be working with the robots, they're going to be interfacing with an iPad, which is cool technology, right? Everybody's got an iPhone or something very similar.
Mhm.
It's all very familiar to them. So it's not a big change from what they're used to from that perspective, and it definitely simplifies the process, makes their lives better and easier, especially in places where they're pushing heavier carts and having to drag those around for miles, not just cover the distance on their own, but they're also dragging these loads with them. And so they definitely appreciate the robots being there, and the effect and impact that it has on their daily work life.
Mm. Yeah, definitely, and I think that's such an important thing these days, is to be able to have a better user experience around that. Because I think, as Sean touched on there, I mean, we have, in our daily lives, our consumer lives, I guess you want to say, apart from our work lives, I mean, we have, smartphones at the ready. Apps are very easy to use. User interfaces are very important and top of mind. So, like, why can that not be the same in our workplace? And I think, like Sean said, I mean, that the Locust, the way it's set up, certainly allows that to be the case. So I'm curious in that regard, Caleb. I mean, as you've now 3 years, almost 4 years with the Locust bots in place, I mean, are you seeing that it's potentially easier to get new people in the warehouse to work, or retention has increased because of more of maybe an easier way to work, or an enjoyable way to work?
Yeah, there's no question about that, Kevin. I mean, it was one of our early focal points was, we were in a challenging labor market.
Mhm.
I don't think that's an idea that we threw up there on the board early on, where it was like this concept of, hey, we're going to bring people in, they're going to see the robots and they're going to want to come to work here. But it's certainly been one of those like indirect benefits where, both from a client recruitment standpoint as well as a employee recruitment standpoint, it's they're flashy, they're fun to look at, they're fun to interact with. So yeah, I don't think there's any question that it has had a positive impact on recruiting for sure.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. And it was referring to the employee recruiting there, but you mentioned the client recruiting as well. So, I mean, you guys are 3PL, right? So you're looking for clients out there, and trying to attract them to you versus other 3PL. So I'm curious. I mean, have the robots played a part in helping to be more attractive to some potential clients? Do you see clients that are asking if you do have some type of robotics or automation in place?
Yeah, I think we've had a level of clients that maybe quite honestly know to ask that question.
Mm.
But then, for others, it's more of when we kind of explain, we deal with a lot of brands who, maybe their day to day volume is average, and then they have a promo or whatever the case may be where they see volume spike 50 to 100%. And so That's how we leverage capacity here at Webster on a day-to-day basis. And so we're really able to explain, like when they ask, like, hey, we're going to give you 50% more volume on, the second Wednesday of the month. How are you going to handle that? Well, I can tell you to a pretty finite line count of how many lines or items that we can pick in a day. And so that's kind of how we're able to answer that question. So yeah, I think it has certainly, much like employee recruiting, it has had a positive impact on client recruitment as well.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty interesting to hear, because I do wonder, like, are there clients out there that are like, we want to work with somebody that's utilizing automation or robotics, or do they just, as long as a package gets out the door, they're good, right? So, I mean, but to that regard, where you mentioned there, they're going to have, 50% more because they're running a promo or something. I mean, how do you navigate with the robots now when you get to like a peak season, or if there's going to be a promo like that? I mean, how did you factor in, or how do you make sure you have enough robots on standby to be able to handle that additional volume?
Yeah, we sat down early on and we used historical data and growth trends to kind of project out what our average lines per day were going to be. And then we worked with the Locust team to say, okay, we want to be able to hit X amount of lines per day. What's the bot recommendation that you have? And, we chose to not be conservative, and we probably, our spend is probably a little bit higher in that space just to give us some added capacity. I know I'll let Sean speak on specifics, but at the time, Locust had a option where you could add peak season robots, and I think that remains true. We've not had to do that to date. We've had enough added capacity, and for periods throughout the week, we'll have bots that we don't use, but there are times in the month on those promo days, etc., or maybe early in the week coming out of weekend volume that we'll run at capacity. So yeah, and even outside the added capacity, it just gives you a level of consistency that, you're just unfortunately not able to achieve when you're dealing with 100% manual pick process. You deal with call-ins, you deal with a whole list of things that can impact your capacity on a day-to-day basis. And there's certainly still some of that, like Sean talked about, you still have to have humans to interact with the bots, but we are far more consistent when we start getting up towards that upper level of our capacity. We're far more consistent than maybe we were when we were picking 100% manually. So I think there's kind of two sides to that.
Interesting. And Sean, you want to chime in there, talk about kind of how people can navigate some of those spikes in capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenge everybody faces, right? Especially in the retail sector, for our 3PL customers that are dealing with retail customers on their side. Holiday peak is a big deal, right? So typically traditional world with fixed automation, whether it's, some type of sorter or goods to person shuttle system, you've got to build out that system to handle your highest projection, right? Your highest projection, not just today, but maybe 7 years down the road, because that's probably where your ROI lands. With the robots, we're able to scale up as the customer needs change. So if it's a short-term volume increase for like a holiday peak, our engineering team is going to work with the customer side. We're going to dive into the numbers, dive into their projections, and give them our calculations on how many bots they need to get through that holiday spike. Work with them to understand how long they need it. And we'll do a short-term bot rental to match that holiday peak and those needs. And then in today's world, things are changing, right? More and more companies are online, right? So more and more these, online sales, whether it be like an Instagram sale or TikTok-based sale. And our 3PL clients specifically are seeing volume surges all over the place. So not quite as predictable and reliable as just a holiday peak that comes in, late October, November, December. But this might be a spike that shows up in June, July. They may do monthly specials with some of their customers. So we're currently, in conversations and working on developing, framework and different plans that we can implement with our customers to handle these surges as well. At the end of the day, it all starts with us sitting at the table with the customer, understanding what their real challenges are, and then having them, work with us with an open mind to understand, how flexible we can be to fulfill those challenges in some different ways. So we've got some programs in place that we're going to be rolling out, and a lot of a lot of exciting things, I think, happening across the board at Locus right now.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that flexibility is such a key as well, when you're dealing with potentially like ups and downs and volume and spikes and things of that nature. Do you have enough bots, not enough bots, and can you, handle peak without having to go back to a hybrid of manual and the robotic picking options too. So it's great that you work with the customers to be able to provide those types of flexible options as well. So I do want to open it up to the audience here. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll bring you up on stage here and you can chime in as well. But in the meantime, if people are thinking about questions, I'm curious, Caleb, with close to 4 years here with Locus, I think you mentioned it's going to be 4 years almost at this point. What are some of the biggest kind of takeaways you would say to give to somebody if they're just now starting to think about, we might want to get automation or robotics into our facility or our operation?
Yeah, I think it's just deciding what you're after, right? Is it strictly just an ROI play where you're trying to get some P&L productivity, or is this a growth strategy? Because I think much to Sean's point, when you're talking with that team about their projections and how many bots they project you need, et cetera, like that's going to be key in making those decisions. Again, for us, like, we're in operations, right? Cost is always a focus of that. We want to remain competitive on the cost side, but for us, that was not the objective. The objective was growth and scalability, and that really helped us in guiding some of those early decisions, not only with what solution we were going to go with, but ultimately, making the final call on how many bots we needed, et cetera. So I think that's the most important part, is just deciding really what you need to get out of this. Like for us, it was the growth and scalability and kind of making that pick process a little less manual and finding the blend of those two things. So that would be my advice.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Good advice there. And Thomas did send me a message with a question. He says, have they done a ROI investment and when did it hit? Interesting question.
Yeah, I think for us, I think the answer to that question would be no. Don't have the specific stats to speak on that today. But again, for us, that was not the focus. The focus was growth and scalability and being able to provide that. I think we checked that in year one. And, Sean alluded to this earlier in the call, but we are always continuous improvement focused. And we're still continuing to focus on how we can get a little bit more cost savings through productivity increases, if you will. So not really prepared today to speak on the financial impact side, but it did check the box that we were looking to check.
All right. Interesting. And definitely appreciate that insight there. And I think I just saw Dave Reese had raised your hand.
So from a productivity standpoint, and I understand, at some point you make decisions based on throughput, that you're trying to achieve throughput, ultimately hit service levels. So you're investing for that. ROI is not as important. So you deprioritize that. From a productivity level, from your manual pick to the use of this file, what do you see from an improvement of individual picking productivity and throughput? And I know that throughput's more of a measure, how many bots do you put, but from a picking standpoint, what are you seeing, or how are you measuring that today compared to where you were measuring it before? Because you got such a different process.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. We are saving about 19% on a kind of cost per line. That's how we measure it. So a cost per line, we're saving about 19% from a sheerly picking standpoint. But then I would say part of that is the process is easier. The kind of non-tangible side to that is that tracking is much easier. So one of the things we didn't touch on today is kind of how we track picking productivity. And with the Locus solution, one wears a badge that's connected to their username or their name, however you decide to implement that process. And we get real-time feedback. The floor leadership gets real-time feedback on, just how many units per hour that each selector is picking. And then they can see that on the screen as well. So, yeah, overall, we saw about a 19% increase or decrease in cost per line picked. in labor cost per line picked. But then, some of that is the overall process was easier, and some of it was easier to track productivity. But great question, Dave. Thanks for the question.
Interesting. Sean, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So, the way we're doing that, when we're going in and doing our concept with the customer, we are taking into account their baseline productivity. And then we're doing our analysis and putting out our projected productivity, typically in an LPH, right? Lines per hour is how we like to measure. But if the customer prefers a UPH, we can go there. And then with that, we're aligning with the customer every step of the way. So based on the productivity gains, the headcount assumptions, that's how we're generating a projected ROI to the customer. To Caleb's point earlier, right, this project specifically wasn't about ROI as much as it was about capacity. So that's probably why he doesn't have a quick and fast answer for you there, because I'm sure they could capture it pretty quickly. But the other side of the coin, like I talked about earlier, is that continuous improvement and optimization, right? As the life of a contract with our customer continues, things change, right? The dynamics of their operation change, the product may change, volumes have certainly changed over the last 4 years. So that's where optimization really comes in and plays a huge role in maintaining a healthy relationship with our customers. We continually want to work with them to understand what the product is, what the order profiles are, and how we can best service that with our system and our robots.
All right, very interesting stuff. And Dave, I really appreciate the question as well. Thanks to Caleb and Sean for responding there. And now it looks like we got a question from Joe here as well.
Caleb, you talked a lot about this being more of a play for capacity growth for you, as well as, dealing with, I believe you said, a more challenging labor market, I'm guessing based on the location that you're in. So kind of a two-part question. By putting in the robots and the Locus solution, how much capacity were you able to open up? And then the second part is, with the change in the workflow, has it actually opened up your hiring pool a little bit more, as you've been able to attract some people who may have been on the border about wanting to work within a warehousing environment now?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I would say we gave Locus a kind of target line goal per day that we wanted to pick. It wasn't necessarily substantially larger than what we could pick manually. I think I tried to highlight this earlier, but just to reemphasize for us, I can confidently say day in, day out that we can hit that top line. So we probably picked up about 20% from a capacity standpoint, but we picked up indiscretional amount of consistency in being able to hit that top line. So hopefully that answers that side of the question. And yes, absolutely, on the recruiting side, there's no question that it is easier to recruit and or retain in the picker role specifically than it was prior to having robots in that space.
Awesome. Thanks.
Interesting. Yeah. Good question there. I'm curious, Caleb, on the recruitment side as well. I mean, when you bring in, somebody for a potential role and you interview them and they come into the facility, I mean, do you show them the robots and that they'll be working with them as a way to kind of maybe entice them a little bit?
Yeah, we do. There's some legal aspect where we protect the brands that we have in house, and we don't disclose those. But at the right point in the interview process, yes, they get to see the automation and see what they're going to be working with, and quite honestly, just ensure that this is a role that they're interested in proceeding with. So yes, to answer your question.
Interesting. And Sean, you got any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll just, to piggyback on some of that. A lot of our customers hire a lot of temp employees and things like that. And with the Locus system, I believe the training time and the time it takes for a picker to go from, first few minutes on the floor to being proficient in the operation is measured in minutes with Locus versus, sometimes days or longer with other systems. So it's been our experience that the training time and the ability to get somebody from the street to proficiency is rapidly improved with our system. And that's one of the features that a lot of our customers have highlighted.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think that's such a great thing to call out, is just the ease of training and ramp up time to get somebody picking and moving with the Locust bot. I know the first time I tried it, I was pretty impressed with how quickly it was to understand and just start picking items. So, I mean, Caleb, do you see like a much more increased, or I guess decreased, training time when you bring new people in now?
Yeah, I think with our WMS, the picking process was not necessarily difficult before. It was the travel part was labor intensive, right? I've highlighted that several times, but I will say to Locust's benefit, it doesn't get much easier than picking with the Locust solution. So yeah, I concur with all of that about the training. The other thing I will say is, I myself, when if I'm out there picking, right, and if you have any person that has any type of a competitive spirit or nature, personally, like the gamification feature is also, really fun. You know where you're standing. You actually get a little first place icon up in the top right hand corner of the iPad. And so, even outside of the training, like if you come to work and you have a little bit of a competitive nature about you, it's also fun to try to go out there and get the most lines picked or move yourself into that first spot. So that, yeah, there's a couple of different aspects that are really cool.
Nice. Yeah, and I think that makes it a lot of fun. Absolutely. So I want to thank everybody for listening and sticking with us here. And thank Caleb and Sean for joining us as well. So Caleb, any last closing thoughts for people maybe that are considering automation or robotics in their operation?
No, I think we covered it well. I thought it was a great conversation. Thank you for having me on. And Sean, thank you for joining to help cover some of the points. But no, I think great conversation. I think we covered all the avenues.
All right, fantastic. And if people are interested in getting in touch with you or learning more about Webster Fulfillment, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look us up on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, and feel free to reach out and we'll get back in touch.
All right, great. And Sean, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, obviously, thank you to Caleb and the whole team at Webster for being a great partner. Happy to be invited here to speak with you also. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Caleb, for the opportunity here. If anybody, is interested in learning more, finding out how Locust might be able to help them in their operation, feel free to reach out to me directly via LinkedIn or my email, as well as, we've got our webpage. We're all over LinkedIn, Instagram, and other as well. So I'd be more than happy to have any conversations that come forward.
All right, great. And thank you both so much for joining in on the conversation today and giving us all these great insights around automation and robotics within the warehousing space. And thank you to Webster Fulfillment specifically for sponsoring today's event. And thank you for everybody tuning in as well. So appreciate you and have a good day. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the new warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for The New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.